before we start the conversation, I can tell you that we will first have a conversation on our own, and then afterwards we will let you ask questions. And we have 3 microphones on different sides. So if you have questions to ask, and you can come out and line up, and then afterwards we will let you ask questions. But first, we'll let Anke ask first.
Hello, good evening. First of all, I would like to say that I'm very honored to sit here. I was brought up with the new German cinema, but I just can say that Werner Herzog's cinema is unique, impossible to classify, and timeless. So whenever I see a film by Werner Herzog again, it's like seeing it for the very first time. So I'm quite happy that we can explore his cinema here together. And I already had the chance to speak with him, and he told me that I should put my papers away. And when we were standing here, he started to talk about the music and maybe the final music of your movie. Maybe it's a good starting point, because you started to tell me a very interesting story.
Well, at the very beginning and at the end, you hear music that is Russian Orthodox church music. And I found a very beautiful piece of music, and it was from the monastery of the Patriarch in Moscow himself. And there was no problem to acquire the rights, we were told, yes, but the church officials wanted to say in which context the music was used. And they immediately said this cannot be, because the music that I had chosen was voices of angels, which I did not know. And you cannot superimpose it over images of hell. And it's a serious question, because for the Orthodox Russian Church, hell is a physically real place on our planet. So, and there has been a discussion in the Orthodox Church, I think in the 17th century, so 400 years ago. Over decades it was debated whether hell was a metaphor, or whether it was an imagination, or whether it was a real physical place on our planet. The decision at that time was, yes, it is a physical, it's a physical location on our planet Earth. And I was told I could not really use this film. We debated, we tried to debate, and it started a discussion like in the 17th century, basically, and I understood I cannot do this. You have to respect. You have to respect the demand, and I said, I will find a different music. It should be okay. What you hear now is very beautiful, but the music originally was even better. But sometimes you have to compromise when you do a film.
And shooting the movie, did you ever feel, oh, the volcano is a kind of hell?
No, it's just a very fascinating event, and it's a very cinematic event. It's really made for cinema. Like, for example, in Mad Max car crashes. It's something very, very cinematic. Or, for example, Kung Fu films are something very, very cinematic. And I do understand the appeal of these films. Or Fred Astaire is movie. And in a way, volcanoes have a very strange fascination. And of course, fascination comes, we all know, this magma is under us everywhere, even under the seabeds. And we owe to the volcanoes the air that we breathe. Before that, the atmosphere was methane, and only because of activities of volcanoes, our planet started to have an atmosphere that is prerequisite for life, or for human life at least. So there's a deep fascination, and of course a looming danger. You know, it's this planet is not completely safe nowhere, and the planets are the continents are shifting, they are floating, and all this comes to mind when you deal with volcanoes.
So it's not the first time that you go to a remote, dangerous place to shoot a movie. So which stories did you expect here, or what kind of stories did you want to tell?
I followed basically the lead of Clive Oppenheimer, the volcanologist, and he proposed we should go, for example, to Iceland because there's so much activity, and we were looking more into areas where new gods were created, or like in Iceland, 1,000 years ago, or more than 1,000 years ago, it was about the death of the gods, the demise of the gods, and I'm reading from old Icelandic poetry about cataclysms and the end of some gods. Or, for example, North Korea, very, very fascinating because Kim Il-sung and his son and his grandson have almost godlike qualities, and new gods are being created, or like in Vanuatu, in the archipelago, all of a sudden a very strange cult originates. John Frum, an American airman, and we don't even know whether he ever existed or not, and yet he has become a god and lives inside of the volcano. So, of course, we were trying to focus in those areas.
It's not the first time that you filmed a volcano. You already did it in 1977 in Guadeloupe. And at that moment, the volcano was going to explode. And I just want to know whether you want to continue with this movie, the narration of the other one about mankind, death, and legends about volcanoes.
It's not a real continuation, but of course, at the time, it was a very fascinating event because we knew the volcano would explode, and it was the geological structure of the mountain was in such a way that there wouldn't be a normal lava eruption. The mountain had to explode first before lava could come out. And it would be an explosion maybe 10, 15 times the magnitude of the Hiroshima atomic bomb. So it was kind of serious. And the entire island was evacuated, and I had 2 cinematographers with me, and we decided that there was a seismic crisis. We had these shocks and up to 5 point something on the Richter scale, which are kind of serious shocks, and it was 1,400 shocks all night long. And so we had to decide, and they had to decide, do we do the film or not? So the real question was, what is more, sometimes I think your work is more important than, let's say, ultimately your life. It sounds pathetic, but what is it more important to do the film, or are we caring too much about our own ass?
Yes, but yeah. What happened with the film material? So each night, did you send it away?
No, you can send anything away. It was all evacuated. We had a car, and we bypassed the roadblocks that were set up by military and by police in the jungle. And then we had the roadblocks behind us, and the volcano was some 20 kilometers away. So we went up there. You can drive up pretty far. It's only 1,400 meters high in the jungle. And it was kind of unpleasant because it was all silent. The birds had disappeared from the jungle, and the snakes had fled. And they all fled into the ocean, and they drowned, and they came washing back to the shore. So when I saw this, I knew it doesn't look really good. And then we filmed up there, and we filmed quickly for a few hours, and then we fled. But the cinematographer, the American cinematographer, who was very short-sighted, he left his glasses up there. And I said next day, I said to him, Edward, you know what, I'm going back and I find your glasses.
And did you do it?
I did it, but he and the other Schmidt-Reitwein, the second cinematographer, they said, if you go, we come with our cameras. So let's do more shooting. And we couldn't find, there was no chance to find the glasses because the mountain had completely changed. There was so much activity that you couldn't recognize the entire landscape up there anymore. And we did some more filming and then we fled. And strangely enough, the mountain never exploded. It probably, all the energy, the explosive energy probably was built down in kinetic energy of shock waves, of earthquakes. So nobody knows for sure, but it did not explode, and it felt kind of strange that it didn't explode.
But you should be lucky that it didn't explode. I mean.
Yeah, of course, you have to be lucky once in a while in your life. Yes. And you can see, now, I have to say I'm not a daredevil, and I have no reason to go out and risk much. It was pretty much the only time where there was blind lottery. All the other times we were filming, there's only in this volcano film a moment in Indonesia where we filmed an eruption, and only a few days later at the same place where we were filming, all in all, I think 14 farmers died. They were caught by a bigger explosion, and that was only a few days later. So, but you have to be prudent, and you have to be ready to film, and you do it like a snake. You go in quickly, you strike quickly, and you immediately move out. So to shorten your time.
In the movie, there's a funny moment when the scientist says to you, oh, everybody was afraid to shoot a movie with you, and you just laugh and reply, oh, but I'm the clinical sane director, the only one on earth. So
the only clinically sane director in the
and,
business.
But you did a lot of, would you really say that you never did anything unreasonable while shooting? I mean,
no, I'm a professional filmmaker, let's face it.
Yes, for sure.
And what happens in the media or in the general perception, sometimes audiences or reviewers try to identify you with the protagonists of your films. Aguirre, the Wrath of God, a pretty mad sort of character, and they try to impose this image on me. Or in Fitzcarraldo, a man who has his fever dreams in the jungle, great opera in the jungle. Those are projections. But they do not point directly at me. In a way, very remotely, yes, because I wrote the screenplays. I came up with these stories, but people believe I must be the man who did Aguirre, must be like Aguirre, and that's a mistake. And for example, on my sets, there's never a loud word. It's always very, very focused work. It's like in surgery, when you have surgeons and you have assistant doctors and you have nurses around, there's only whispers. There's very quick professional work in whispers. And there's never been a loud word ever in my films. And I work fast.
But apart from your films, we've seen films like the making of Fitzcarraldo by Les Blanc, the Burden of Dreams,
yes.
Which actually we can see you at work on the Fitzcarraldo sets, and it's really very dangerous, and of course we didn't really see you yelling at people, but it's not like a usual set of filming.
That is true because nobody has moved a ship over a mountain. So that's unusual because it has no precedence in technical history. So nobody knew how to do it. I knew I could do it and I knew how to do it. But how shall I say, we had a Brazilian engineer who quit. He became frightened, and he was afraid that a dead post which held all the cables that held the ship when it moved up would eventually pop out and people could get killed. So I stopped shooting for 12 days, and I had a tree, an entire gigantic tree, inserted into a hole in the ground. It was so deep it could have supported 20 ships of that size, 20. And I knew that was a safe dead post now. Now we go back to work. So yes, you have to acknowledge the dangers, but it's not that I ever risked anyone's life.
Maybe
you just don't do it for a movie.
Maybe we could talk a bit about nature, because nature for me is always playing a main part in your movies, and we have characters like Aguirre who tries to control or to colonize the nature. Then we have the grizzly man who stands for Disneyfication for nature. So what are they looking? Are they all lost in nature, or what is their fight? Are they fighting against nature, or what? How would you describe it?
Well, number one, I think it is correct to see that quite a few of my films are in wild nature, like in the jungle or in the desert or in Antarctica or in the Himalayas. So, but it would be too narrow to see it only in this respect, because I've done other films like the film on the internet, Lo and Behold, Reveries of the Connected World, and it's really only about the internet and cell phones and artificial intelligence, and so has nothing to do with nature. So, but it is correct, yes, there is nature, and our relationship to wild nature is something which is important, because we have, or many of us, many civilizations have lost the contact to nature. And it was very beautiful that today I have seen two things. The fish market here, and all the fish and all the creatures are still alive. There's still something really going on. And then I was a little bit further up on Hong Kong Island, and it's very steep up. And behind the building where I was, there's wild nature, there's jungle, and you hear songs of birds, and all of a sudden, right 50 meters behind this high rise, you have wild nature, and that's Hong Kong. And I found it totally stunning, and hearing all the bird voices, and I thought, do I hear right? Yes, but this is a fantastic city. It even has that a part of the incredible beauty of it. The real thing about Hong Kong is this kind of intensity of life. It's a very vibrant life here. So you see it instantly. You don't have to live here. You know it in 2 hours flat.
Your intense relationship to nature, is it connected to your childhood? Maybe you were brought up the first years in a remote village in the Bavarian Alps?
Probably that's maybe part of it, because I was actually born in the city of Munich, but when I was only 2 weeks old, Munich was carpet bombed and many buildings around completely destroyed, where we lived damaged. And I was only 2 weeks old, 14 days old, and my mother found me in my cradle with a thick layer of glass shards and bricks on my cradle, but I was completely unhurt. And she fled with my older brother to the mountains, and that's where it was safe, so remote that, for example, we had no running water. In the beginning, hardly electricity. It came then, it was more permanent that there was electricity, and we had, for example, in summer no shoes. We were barefoot, and of course no cinema, no radio. I did not even know that cinema existed until I was 11. I had no idea it even existed. And because I found out about cinema at such a late time in my life, I always had the feeling I'm the inventor of cinema. And until today, it's very strange, because I had a brief debate with my cinematographer, and he said, but we shouldn't do it. Nobody does it like that. I said, what do you mean by nobody? No, in the cinema, you don't do this like this. And I said, why should we care? We are inventing cinema at this very moment. And it was a film I only did 2 years ago. So, and I still have this feeling that whatever the others are doing in cinema, I don't care much, and I don't see that many films. I see very few films. However, I do read. And that's something which I try to tell young filmmakers. You have to read. Read. And too many are on their cell phones and they read. Yes, I do read, but they read tweets, or they read Facebook entries, or they read very brief, shallow sort of information that comes from the internet. Number one, don't trust in the internet. That's one thing. And number two, you should read more when you try to make films. And by the way, all the real great filmmakers that I know, they're all reading a lot. Everyone of the real good ones. Sorry that I'm sorry, I don't want to preach. I'm only trying to address a few filmmakers here, the younger ones.
So, and I guess you were 21 when you already founded your own production company. So why did you do it?
Nobody wanted to produce my films.
So you had to do it.
And I had to earn the money from because
you worked in a steel factory, didn't you?
Yeah, I worked in a steel factory, but I worked a night shift because I was in school, in high school during day, but not all the time. But I earned enough money. I worked as a welder, but a primitive form of welding, because welding itself is a very difficult, great craft and art. It has something really artistic, and I have never gotten deep into welding. It was a primitive form of welding. Basically what you see now done by robots in car manufacturing, this kind of electric contact welding. So, I earned the money to make my first films.
But what kind of films did you have in mind at that time, or what kind of images?
You can see them when you see my early films.
Yeah, I saw them. So just.
And they are not what was produced at that time. And there are some films that you still haven't seen yet. That they are different and strange, or not part of a landscape, or not part of a landscape of filmmaking, or a trend of filmmaking. So I've never cared about trends.
But what makes you want to make films rather than perhaps you can write, you can be a novelist, or for different kind of artists, or maybe in music, but why do you choose to make films?
Well, it's not that I just make films. I have actually written, and I do believe that what I have written, the prose books like Of Walking in Ice, and then another book, Conquest of the Useless, I do believe they will outlive my films. There's more direct substance in it. And I may be wrong, but God knows. But I have also done operas, and I have acted in films. I'm good as a villain. I mean, there's a film which is kind of funny to watch, Jack Reacher, and I'm really playing the real bad guy, and I was paid well to be frightening, and I actually was kind of frightening on screen, and they paid me well for it.
You once said that you feel like a soldier of cinema. What did you mean by that? And is cinema really a battlefield for you?
No, it's you don't see it in military terms. Oh, okay. No, I said that once, and I have adopted this kind of thing later on. I was asked about artistic concepts, and you are an artist, and how do you see yourself in conflict or contrast or in unison with other forms of art, and I had the feeling it's a wrong description. I'm a working man. I'm really working, and secondly, and somehow out of the blue, I said, no, I don't feel like an artist. Yeah, what are you then? And I said, I'm a soldier. Okay. I want to be a good soldier of cinema. And that's where I feel much better at home. And these concepts of art or ingenious, and so they belong to different centuries. The time is over. There's no more adventure. It's over. There's artists, I have my doubts. When you look at contemporary art, I think much of it is garbage. And number two, I say much of it. There are some very fine, very, very fine things around. But the art, what makes me suspicious, for example, is the art market. When you look at the art market, it's a form of organized crime with rigging of prices and where things are manipulated between galleries and museums and the art market and publications about it. It's all like a form of organized crime, a low level, not really visible. But I'm highly suspicious about the art market, for example, and everybody who has his or her feet on the ground will feel the same.
Speaking to a soldier of cinema, would you say that for a filmmaker it is important to accept defeats?
Of course, yes, but I'm trying to hold an outpost that many have abandoned. But of course, I have had many defeats, and it depends on how do you get back on your feet again. That's, I think that's essential, and also when we speak about being a soldier, much of it has to do with discipline. Disciplined work, disciplined, responsible, dealing with, let's say, money, the budgets. And I'm very, very careful to stay on budget or under budget. And I think I've never been over budget in my life. Sometimes under budget. And it's a question of long-time survival. If you go constantly over budget and wildly over budget, it has destroyed the strongest of the strong, including Orson Welles, for example, who would spend the entire budget and he wasn't even finished with pre-production. He had thrown out the money for the entire film, for preparing a movie and living lavishly, and so it ultimately the industry turned against him, and he had a lifespan in cinema maybe a dozen years, not much more. And in filmmaking, you have to be very, very careful. You can survive much longer when you are a musician, when you play the cello. You can play the cello at age 90 and still be dignified and still create great music. Cinema is much more treacherous.
In which way?
It destroys those who work in it.
But I don't have the feeling that you are destroyed. I mean...
No, I'm not, but I'm one of the few. I accept your laughter, but I advise you look into film history. Film history shows us that statistically, filmmakers normally are actively working and working well, normally have not much more than 15 years of lifespan in their profession. And there are very few, not many, very few who do it over a whole lifetime. And I'm in this profession since I'm 19, 20, 21 or so. And I have continued, and I'm still around and alive. But it has taken a lot of attention, and among others to understand the world of cinema and how it functions and how you can somehow survive, sometimes barely, but I'm still around. I'm speaking of statistics.
Yeah, you also said that a filmmaker has to learn to do the doable. And reading about your movies, I mean, Aguirre, you had to deal with 400 monkeys, for example. How did you develop your sense for doing doable?
Some of it has to do with a sense for the real world and practically functioning in it. The monkeys in Aguirre, we had 400 monkeys, and at that time there was no real regulation of wildlife. Let's say you could buy a very rare parrot at the market in Amazonia, in Peru, in the Amazon part, and there was a trader who would send 10,000 parrots to Miami, or hundreds of monkeys to private people around in the world. And half a year before shooting, I started to organize to have 400 monkeys. I knew I would need them. And I paid half the price. There was not a single monkey yet as an incentive. And I said the other half I pay upon delivery. What happened was that the owner of this enterprise had actually organized the catching of hundreds of monkeys, but he sold it to someone else then. And he was still sitting on half my price. And by coincidence, I came to the airport where I just saw them being loaded on a transport plane to Miami. And I immediately shouted at the transport people. I said, where are the documents for the vaccinations? And I said, I'm here, the veterinarian. Where are the documents? And of course there were no documents, I knew that. And I said, unload the monkeys and I will have them for vaccination. And I loaded it on my truck and off I went. In fact, I paid the dealer of the monkeys, I paid him the full price at the end. But the skunk would have disappeared with half my money and I wouldn't have a single monkey. So you have to function in the real world.
Yeah, let's stick to doing the doable. Working with Klaus Kinski also belonged to do the doable?
Yes, Kinski, you probably do not know much about him, but an extremely volatile actor, completely irresponsible and always at the verge of paranoia. So to make him productive for the screen was a difficult, hard work. So it's kind of hard work, but when I say do the doable, I can give you an easier example. We were filming in a salt desert and I needed the camera exactly at ground level. That means we had to dig into the salt and bring the lens exactly at that level with the floor. But what we didn't know before, the salt was hard like cement. And we hacked into it for, I don't know, an hour until we had a trench half a meter wide and about that deep so that we could bring the lens onto the level. 2 days later, the cinematographer, and we had only 16 days for an entire feature film. And we were rushing in a dramatic rush against time because some of the actors had to work in other films. We had delays which were not caused by the organization. For example, the father of the leading actress died, and of course I said to her, come later, your father has to be buried first. So we had another 5 days of delay and shortened. And on one of those days after we had experienced how hard it was, he said, yeah, we should have a big hole in the salt and we should all hide in there. And I said to him, Peter Zeitling, Peter, it will take us half a day until we dig this hole as deep as that. We can shoot 5 full sequences in 5 hours. And I said to him, we do the doable. And we are not going to have, I don't know how much equipment down in the ground. So it's as simple as that.
Well, actually, it's about time that we'll give the audience a chance to ask questions. And those of you who want to ask questions, you can come up to the different microphones on the 2 sides and in the middle. Then we will let you ask the questions. Okay. Yeah, you go first.
Yeah, hello, Mr. Herzog. I just want to ask you a question is, would you like to live for another 100 years with good health?
No, not really, because I think it would be a very unpleasant life to grow that old. I think it becomes unpleasant when you are 100 even. And we have to live with the fact that our lifespan is very limited, and it would be awful if we lived over centuries. It would be terrifying to see the same cycles of idiocy returning and returning. So I'm not into that business.
Okay, over there.
Thank you. Hi, my question is about the scenes in North Korea. I noticed that you said that in North Korea everything is presentation and that you see what they want you to see. And I guess I was kind of wondering, do you really think that's that different from other societies? And if so, how? And my second kind of piggybacking question is, as a filmmaker, when you present people's stories to an audience, how do you feel you relate to how people want you to interpret them? If that makes sense.
Well, I've never really known exactly who was going to see my films. It's a big mystery. I have no clear idea who is going to see my film, under which perspectives they're going to see my films. For example, the film Aguirre, The Wrath of God, shown to inmates in a maximum security prison in the United States all of a sudden becomes a different film. It shifts, it changes with the perception of each audience. And what is going to happen in the city of Wuhan in 60 years from now, when they see the young people at that time in the future, I have no clue. So I have never worked for any expectance. However, I'm a storyteller. And when I stumble into a story, and I've basically always written my own stories in my own screenplays, I would instantly know this is big. This is so big, I have to make the film, and it will find an audience. So, and it's always something which I have never fully understood, and is not completely random, because I know that I share certain things with audiences. I do have visions, or I do have insights that others do not see yet. I see something clear at the horizon, and I can articulate it. And that's probably what a real storyteller has to have in himself or in herself. That you see something clearly, and you know you will get such a big story across to an audience. But I have no plans or no strategies or anything like that. The film industry has strategies in Hollywood when they do the fifth sequel to Rambo, the sixth sequel to Star Wars. Yes, there's a franchise there, and you can somehow calculate the expectations. But I have never been in a position to make any calculations.
Hi, in your masterclass, you talked about taking certain liberties and sort of making moments happen in a way that's more cinematic, and I couldn't help but wonder, with that chair looking at the empty TV in the church and things like that, were there a few moments here where you sort of nudged things to happen in a way that you might prefer?
What I'm trying to do is, when I do a film, to stay open for the unexpected, because you cannot always formulate what your plans are, and when you squeeze an idea or a story too much into a rigid framework, all of a sudden life might disappear out of it. And it always happens during shooting of a film, like, for example, Bad Lieutenant, Port of Call, New Orleans. I saw many things that were not in the screenplay. That was, by the way, a screenplay that I had not written. But I saw in a tree on a big branch, I saw an iguana. And I was so fascinated, and I said, can somebody organize and get me 1 or 2 iguanas? Next day I would like to put them on the coffee table of the detectives. And the unexpected, the things that were not planned, all of a sudden make an impact on audiences. It's much more vivid and much more lasting than many other parts of the film. Nobody who has seen the film Bad Lieutenant will ever forget the iguanas on the coffee table, because it's so crazy and so strange.
Okay, in the middle.
I followed your films for many years. I just wonder what made you stop making narrative films and go solely into documentary films? And the second question is, will you ever consider making a narrative film again?
What was
the second part? Can you repeat?
Will you ever consider making a narrative film again?
Yes, I will. I have actually done, I think, 5 feature films in the last 10 years, which is quite a lot as an average, but I have done more than 10 documentaries at the same time. And in 2 weeks from now, I will be in Tokyo and start a very, very small, no-budget feature film, for example. So you shouldn't worry whether I jump from documentary to feature film. So my most successful film arguably was done for YouTube about texting and driving, and millions saw it instantly. So, and it's neither a documentary nor is it a feature film. It's some sort of a public
instructional video.
Yeah, instructional, a public service announcement of telephone providers for AT&T, but of course T-Mobile and Sprint and Verizon, and so they all jumped on board. So, and it doesn't really matter. I think I'm doing all right in documentaries and I'm doing all right in feature films.
Okay, over to this side.
Hi. Well, I only started watching your movies just recently, and I think the one thing I enjoy the most is how you film the people in your documentaries. So my question is about how you decide what to do with the people you film, because sometimes you tease them, like the way you did with the North Korean professor, or you make fun of them, like the comments you made on the professor digging up bones in a desert.
I do not make fun of them, sorry.
No? Or maybe
No.
you just leave them in front of your camera forever, like in Fata Morgana, so that they feel a bit embarrassed. So I want to know how do you decide what to do.
Sorry to interrupt. I do not make fun of them. I admire them for their enthusiasm. And secondly, in Ethiopia, where they stumbled across early human remains of our species, Homo sapiens, it has happened only the third time in 100 years. So I was totally lucky, and the paleontologist who is working there is completely exuberant in his enthusiasm, and I love him for that. I really love him for that, and it's for the documentary, within the structure of the documentary, everybody in the industry said to me, oh, this is way too long, and I said, correct, it is way too long, but I love it so much, and I want to have young kids who see that entering into science. Yes, it's out of balance. It's because I love it so much. And you are pointing to a bigger question, and that is casting. Casting in documentary films, and I do it a little bit like in feature films, casting actors. And I'm very, very careful about whom I invite and on whom I focus. And because of that, shooting of my documentaries goes rather quickly. I do not shoot much footage. Some other people would, other filmmakers sometimes shoot hundreds of hours, and it's desperate because I don't know what they are doing in many cases. Not always, but in many cases. So there were films where I did very clear and good and careful, I say it in quotes, casting for a documentary like Into the Abyss. You can find it on Netflix. Is Netflix available here in Hong Kong?
Yes. Yep.
Yes, okay. And I think I had 11 or 12 persons in the film, and I literally used almost everything that I shot. So I shot 6 or 7 hours for almost 2-hour movie. And that was all. And I believe that other filmmakers would have easily shot 200, 300 hours. But it was good casting, and it was good management of time and money.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, to this side.
You've filmed in many locations and situations that people would deem quite dangerous, from volcanoes to the jungle to North Korea, and
neither North Korea nor the jungle are dangerous.
I meant that some people may consider to be undesirable places to go, perhaps some perceived danger. But when you were by the volcano there, you mentioned that you would not unnecessarily go down into the volcano to take that risk just for a film. Has there been any situations where you were unable to film something because the danger was too great, or the subject matter even too controversial to approach?
It happens all the time, and you shouldn't harp too much about dangers, because the jungle is just another forest. And North Korea is okay as long as you stick to the rules that they impose on you. So then you'd be all right. You just do not, for example, the cinematographer, again, Peter Zeitlinger, he wanted to smuggle in a drone and have it disassembled and in various pieces of luggage. And I said to him, this is not going to happen, because they will find the drone. And of course we were shooting at the Chinese border, heavily militarized, because if people flee from North Korea, they normally flee across the northern border into China. Military outposts everywhere. You do not fly a drone there. You will end in jail for 20 years. This drone is not going to enter North Korea. If you don't leave it behind, you are not going to be on board. So it's a question of prudence. You have to understand under which circumstances you are working. And of course, there were many times where I planned something that was unwise, like Little Dieter Needs to Fly, a German-born pilot who was shot down over Laos in the very first time of the Vietnam War, and he was captive of Pathet Lao and Viet Cong, the only one who ever managed to escape from this kind of captivity. And we were not allowed to go into Laos, where his plane was shot down, and aerial photos still show remains of his fuselage near a village. And Dieter and I, we said, we were in Thailand at the Mekong River, and we said, you know what, Dieter and I, we decided we'll swim across the river, which is fairly wide, so it's a task by itself, and we take a small camera with it, and we walk 2 or 3 days until we reach the place of the fuselage of your plane. And when the crew learned about it, they were more prudent than I was and Dieter, and they dissuaded us. They said it doesn't make sense. The harvest is too unimportant. Do we really need to see some of the remains of his plane? No, it's not that important, so let's forget it. It's a stupid idea. It's just stupid what I planned. And I can be persuaded to forget about it.
Okay, I can only allow 2 more questions, I think, in the middle.
Center, yeah.
Mr. Herzog, thank you for being a true inspiration in both your work and the way you lead your life. I'd like to put one of your questions back to you. I believe you often quote something around how war dreams of itself, and how war dreams of itself, right? This is, and you've asked this question, I believe, in Reveries of the Internet, to maybe Elon Musk or one of those guys, if the Internet dreams of itself. Now, my question to you is this, sort of a rephrase of the question. On YouTube, which you found lots of recent success on, people vlog, right? Vlogging, you know, when people turn the cameras on themselves and film themselves, one-man crew, people have gotten very successful with it. Do you think this is in some weird way the dreams of, this is how the internet is dreaming, or maybe the nightmares of the internet? I don't.
Well, I think it's more the users who reinvent their own life, and they create a falsified, embellished form of self. So the presentation of self has found worldwide new forms. But when you are speaking about war dreaming of itself, I actually asked the question, and I have to be precise. the Prussian war theoretician Clausewitz in Napoleonic times in 1804, so strangely and famously asked in his study about war. Sometimes he says, war dreams of itself. And I found it a very stunning, inexplicable, and mysteriously deep statement. And when I ask scientists about artificial intelligence and about the internet, I quote Clausewitz, the war theoretician. War sometimes dreams of itself. Now comes my question, does the internet dream of itself? And it's a very deep question. I have no answer, and nobody in the film, nobody of the experts has an answer either. But it's worthwhile to think whether the internet itself, in its neurons and connections, creates its own dream identity. And we may not even know, we may never know about it. But it's a question we should ask. And it's strange, although I do not use the internet much, I don't even have a cell phone. I think the film poses question about human beings vis-à-vis the new possibilities of the internet. And although I know very little in practical terms how to use the internet, I think I made the only competent film about the internet. It sounds paradoxical, but I'm convinced.
Okay, the last question tonight, over there.
Yes, I have watched your lesson in the masterclass.com, so it's can't imagine that you will come to Hong Kong one day and I can say thank you to you. And then you have said that you read many poems before writing the script. Some Iceland poems and also Chinese poem. The Chinese poems of tongues, I think it's called Tongxi. Yeah. Can you share something of it and then your impression about Chinese culture? Thank you.
Yes, a wonderful question. Thank you for asking it, because normally I write very fast. I write a screenplay in a week, normally not longer than that. But I see an entire film in front of my face. I see it as if you were sitting in the cinema. And I do the work of somebody who only copies what he sees and hears. But I somehow work myself into the spirit and into the soul of writing by reading poetry. And among my favorites is, of course, Chinese poets of the 8th and 9th century. And I do read other poetry, and I do listen to music. And I do that for a few days, and then I feel now it's the time. My soul has warmed up for this task now. So Chinese poetry has been very helpful. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, that's all the time we have. And thank you all for coming. And thank you, Werner Herzog, for coming to see the Hong Kong audience. And thank you, Anke. Thank you very much.